President Cyril Ramaphosa signing into law of the amendments to the Companies Act has brought in various changes, including how companies deal with ethical issues and force entities to disclose remuneration for directors. These are set to significantly tackle matters around public, state-owned and private entities where governance is concerned. They also form part of a reform agenda aimed at reshaping South Africa's corporate landscape. Chairman at Global Business Solutions, Jonathan Grobler, speaks to us now. Thank you so much for your time. And it's an interesting time to pick up on this because there is an impact of a new remuneration policy that has been approved, but it has an impact on the likes of transparency where shareholder engagement is concerned. Talk to us through that.
Well, good evening to you and your viewers. Thanks for having me. I think the big change is, of course, forced reporting for public and state-owned enterprises in respect to remuneration. Remember, when you compile an employment equity plan in terms of the Employment Equity Act, you've got to disclose remuneration as well, but that's private. It's held by the Department of Employment and Labour and the Commission for Employment Equity. Here, for public-owned companies and state-owned companies, there's quite an onerous reporting of the top salary, complete remuneration of the top person, the bottom person, the top 5%, the bottom 5%, the median and the average in the reporting of the public documents, the annual financial statements. So that's a big change because it's compulsory. Some companies, progressive companies in South Africa, already report on the top and bottom gap. Of course, the differential between the lowest paid worker, we see some banks coming out, financial institutions coming out very strongly with a very high relative minimum wage, saying we will not pay anyone in this particular business less than X. And I think that's progressive where those particular companies can actually afford it. So a big difference in respect to remuneration. Remuneration policies have to be in place and accepted by the Remuneration Committee of the boards. And if you don't accept it, then it has to go to the next meeting, the next financial year to the Remuneration Committee as well. And there are consequences for that. So again, an exposure, transparency. There's been a lot said about executive pay and the top, between the top and the bottom. Now for public and state-owned companies, of course, there's full disclosure around that. I think that's a good thing. I think transparency is a good thing. You know, people always ask me, you know, what about executive remuneration? Isn't it too high? I think that's up to the Remuneration Committee to ensure that when you're paying senior executives, directors, non-executive directors, those are competitive, but not above competitive rates of pay. And if the REM committees don't do their jobs, you should replace them and replace them with people who will be vigilant around ensuring that this can meet public scrutiny.
It sounds fair and seeking to balance the playing field, but let's also talk about the role of this revamped Social and Ethics Committee. It speaks directly to fostering those ethics that are needed within business practices.
And now that applies to, of course, public, state-owned and private enterprise where your public interest score is above 500. And you get to a public interest score looking at remuneration, turnover, 1 point for every million rand turnover, 1 point for every employee you employ. So you get to 500 quite quickly. And that is now a compulsory Social and Ethics Committee looking at issues like employment equity, broad-based black economic transformation, issues around salaries and wages in respect to the wage gap and those issues, as well as, I think a good thing is employee relations. So to my mind, a proper Social and Ethics Committee should have full line of sight around cases like harassment cases, sexual or other harassment cases. Remember, we've got a harassment code of good practice in place. And again, I think good governance and good businesses should stamp out harassment as much as they can because it's just bad scourge in those particular organizations. So I think there's a huge onus on Social and Ethics Committees to get their act together and to really ask and make sure we get progression in the areas of transformation, in the areas of employment relationship, and know the full sight of extensive cases. You don't want to be on a board and hear about the sexual harassment claim or harassment claim or racism claim in the paper. You want to know about it and you want management to deal with it appropriately.
Absolutely progressive once again, but as a parting shot, how do companies and entities factor this into the day-to-day running of any corporation?
I think times have changed. I think this autocratic, dictatorial type leadership has changed, you know, with social media, with people being much more transparent. Unless your management get their act together in terms of engaging staff, I think, you know, in the short to medium term, you've got no chance of really making it. Again, we see these exposures We now have legislation pushing us towards a proper reflection as to where we are. And that's a good thing for South Africa and a good thing for the world. I think South African legislation is progressive. It's world class. It matches up to the world. What we do need is enforcement. One of the problems we have in South Africa, we've got a two-stage economy, I keep on saying. Those that comply and those that don't comply. For the people who don't comply, there's got to be a consequence. Otherwise, the people who comply, their cost of business just goes up disproportionately.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Jonathan Goldberg is with Global Business Solutions talking to us there about the amendment bills that seek to get those improvements within the South African labour landscape, whether it be on the private sector or even in state entities.